Now we will go on to the second speaker of this session, Michael Yang, who will be presenting Algorithmic Reparation.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be giving this talk. Being a messenger for it, since I think our paper, Algorithmic Reparation, has a lot of great relation, is very related and highly salient to the talks in this panel. So I'm Michael, I'm a PhD student at the ANU. The talk, I wrote this paper with my co-authors Jenny Davis and April Williams. I'm acting as a messenger today because I'm just going to be playing the presentation that's given by Jenny, but I'm also really happy to take questions. And again, I think this is a really valuable and important topic for all of us.
Today, we're going to present an idea we call algorithmic reparation. This is a transdisciplinary socio-technical proposal that converges theories of intersectionality with acts of reparation, together applied to algorithmic machine learning. Both intersectionality and reparation have legal historical foundations and each address systemic inequalities. Both have now also expanded beyond their legal origins via intellectual and activist movements. We continue these expansions, fusing intersectionality and reparation into a cogent framework for critical algorithmic reform. The presentation will unpack what we mean by algorithmic reparation and why we think it's important. But if you take one thing away today, it's the point that algorithmic fairness is practically impossible and ideologically wrongheaded in the context of a fundamentally unequal society. We thus propose pushing aside efforts towards fairness and striving instead for equitable and equalizing ends. In service of this, we present algorithmic reparation as a concept and a scaffold for intersectional approaches to machine learning systems. Beyond improving code, a reparative approach uses computational tools for social intervention while critically assessing when and where computation does not belong. Our argument proceeds as follows. First, we review the problem of algorithmic inequality in machine learning, what it is, why it persists, and how technologists have attempted to address the issue. Next, we summarize key tenets of intersectionality, link it to machine learning, and delineate how its pairing with reparation produces a critical orienting framework. With this foundation, we dig into the central techniques that drive the field of fair machine learning, analyzing how and why these techniques are ineffective at combating algorithmic inequality, and thus making the case for an alternative reparative approach. Finally, we discuss methods for and barriers to implementing algorithmic reparation, addressing opportunities and constraints for reparative algorithmic praxis. An algorithm is simply a set of rules for completing a task. In computation, these are encoded mathematical directives which traditionally have been written manually by computer programmers. Machine learning uses a special type of algorithm developed via automated statistical inference procedures over large data sets. Machine learning is utilized by major institutions to guide criminal sentencing, welfare distributions, access to loans, and hiring processes, as well as other resource allocations that shape opportunity structures for individuals and groups. Machine learning also pervades everyday practices through search engines, dating applications, social media platforms, and entertainment streaming services. Machine learning thus informs governance, shapes organizations, and weaves through the mundanities of daily life. Baracus et al. Summarized the machine learning process as a pipeline that proceeds in 4 steps: capture and quantify what is, model generalizations from the training data, apply the model to novel inputs, collect feedback, and refine. Through the course of this pipeline, there are several specific overlapping ways algorithmic inequalities materialize. They can be a product of unjust goals rooted in racist, sexist, heteronormative, ableist, nationalist, and/or colonialist priorities. They can derive from biased, non-representational data. They can use biased proxies, and they can take real population differences that have been created through structural oppression and treat these differences as unproblematic and essential. Put simply, machine learning algorithms are animated by data. Data come from people make up society, and society is unequal. These algorithms thus arc towards existing patterns of power and privilege, marginalization, and disadvantage. The problem with algorithmic inequality is not lost to computer scientists and engineers. There's in fact a vibrant field called fair machine learning, which has emerged with a shared goal of rectifying biases in machine learning systems. However, despite laudable aims, the proposed solutions of this field consistently fall short. Fair machine learning approaches fall short because they stem from what we refer to as algorithmic idealism, enacting computation that assumes a meritocratic society that seeks to neutralize demographic disparities. Such an approach will always be inadequate in a context that is fundamentally unjust. Algorithmic idealism begins with the base belief in equal opportunity, defining the problem of stratification as one caused by fallible human biases on the one hand, and imperfect statistical procedures on the other. This perspective derives from illusory cultural narratives that misalign with the world that is, a world in which discrimination is entrenched, elemental, and compounding at the intersections of multiple marginalization. We take fair machine learning's idealism as our point of departure, proposing instead algorithmic reparation, which reconceives society through a critical intersectional lens. This approach strives not for social equality, which treats everyone the same, but for equity along axes of historical disadvantage. This means doing away with fairness and instead coursing resources to those who've been systematically denied. This approach pairs the logics of intersectionality with the praxis of reparation. Intersectionality is not a singular theory, but an approach and a prism with a set of orienting assertions, goals, and tools. It undergirds critical theories across subfields, all of which share a fundamental focus on systemic power relations that privilege and penalize, centralize, and silence. An intersectional orientation is premised on the notion that identities are multiple and interrelated, shaped by and filtered through societal structures and institutions. These structures and institutions concentrate and compound opportunities and constraints in ways that reflect and reinforce a centralized hierarchical arrangements. However, these arrangements are not predetermined, and practitioners of intersectionality task themselves with revealing and undoing systems of injustice. Intersectionality is not just something to think with, but something to do. It is intellectual method, but also, and in the first instance, a tool for empowering people and fostering social justice. This imperative to treat intersectionality as a grounded, practical, material endeavor can be enacted through its application to machine learning systems, and we suggest animating intersectional politics through practices of reparation. Reparation is a historically grounded mechanism by which offending parties symbolically and materially mend wrongdoings enacted against individuals and groups. Reparative acts are not just backward-looking, but also proactive, aiming to address the way historical wrongdoings affect current and future opportunity structures. Although traditionally applied in a legislative, often geopolitical context, we use reparation in a broader sense, arguing for structural redress through algorithmic reform, mobilizing reparation through the technological assemblages that interweave macro institutions and micro interactions, thus embedding an equitable agenda into the material systems that are part of daily life. This proposal for an intersectional and reparative approach sits in direct opposition to the prevailing logics of fair machine learning, which seek to de-bias algorithms and make them fairer. In contrast, algorithmic reparation assumes and leverages bias to make algorithms more equitable and just. We'll spend a little time now digging into the field of fair machine learning, clarifying why the fairness they seek inevitably eludes. We'll argue that fair machine learning's troubles stem from the field's foundation in algorithmic idealism, a meritocratic misconception of the world, and a political ambivalence this fallacy permits. In a review of the field, Corbett, Davies, and Goel identify three broad categories of fair machine learning: anti-classification, classification parity, and calibration. Anti-classification seeks to erase protected class attributes from consideration. Classification parity tries to distribute errors evenly across social identity groups. And calibration attempts to remove protected class attributes, but conditions this on risk scores. In other words, it's okay to consider race, class, gender, etc., if these are indicators of meaningfully different patterns in which the algorithm is allocating outcomes. A lot of intellectual and computational energy have gone into devising and deploying fair machine learning towards algorithmic systems. This has not gone well. Techniques from each of these fair machine learning genres, anti-classification, classification parity, and calibration, have been used in high-profile cases of algorithms gone awry. Amazon, for example, used anti-classification techniques in an internal hiring algorithm that pre-sorted candidates with the goal of increasing efficiency and mitigating gender biases. However, over the course of a year and multiple iterations, the system, which was trained on the company's previous 10 years of employment data, continued to create gendered proxies that disproportionately favored men until the whole program was eventually scrapped. The other two techniques, classification parity and calibration, both featured in the now infamous story of Compass and their criminal sentencing algorithm. Many of us are familiar with this, but just as a very brief recap, courts were using Compass's sentencing algorithm, which was trained on existing court data to determine defendants' recidivism risk scores. And as exposed by ProPublica, it was delivering consistently harsher outcomes for Black defendants, especially Black men, compared to other groups. The algorithm thus attempted but failed at classification parity. North Point, the company that sells Compass, defended itself by citing calibration, pointing to similar error rates between white and Black defendants. However, if we look into this more closely, those error rates operated in different ways. White defendants' riskiness was underpredicted, while Black defendants' riskiness was overpredicted, thus continuing and exacerbating existing patterns of racialization in the US justice system. In short, attempts at fairness were unachievable because they attempted to grow equality from unequal soil. Algorithmic reparation would instead take stock of base inequities and optimize for their rectification. This means highlighting race, gender, and their intersection rather than attempts to hide these characteristics from the system. It means mathematically bolstering women-identified and non-binary applicants and creating differential, racially conscious criteria in sentencing decisions. It means building algorithms that attend to historical and structural inequalities and auditing systems to determine their viability in this regard. It means dismantling systems that attempt neutrality and insisting instead on algorithms that are just. The technical means of algorithmic reparation are already computationally viable, but its social effects can only take hold through meaningful implementation. It is thus the implementation that we now turn. Rather than reinvent the wheel, we select two recently proposed methods of algorithmic praxis that serve as possible tools of application for the reparative strategies discussed herein. We'll point to archivist data curation and distributed AI power, noting that certainly other methods are out there and being developed as we speak. Activist data curation draws on the professional expertise of archival practice honed by librarians and museum curators, applying these skills to machine learning data. Drawing on their existing skill sets, curation professionals are capable of managing, collecting, arranging, and auditing data in ways that not only avoid re-entrenched inequalities, but optimize for marginal elevation, enacting targeted precision unachievable by those who are not professionally trained in curatorial methods. Distributed AI power is another potential method. This method is premised on undoing standard power asymmetries between those who make and those who are affected by machine learning systems. The approach argues for tools that are legible to and co-created with impacted communities, especially those with histories of vulnerability prior to and re-entrenched with automation. Distributed AI power tactics rely on reciprocal engagement between developers and community stakeholders, with reverse pedagogies by which community stakeholders serve as experts in their lived experiences. This method is exemplified by academic activist collaborative projects undertaken by groups like Data for Black Lives and the Algorithmic Justice League, which both challenge and partner with commercial, governance, and regulatory bodies to enact technical, social, and policy changes. Finally, we want to acknowledge that enacting algorithmic reform requires unvarnished realism about the conditions under which any socio-technical intervention will go into effect. For algorithmic reparation, implementation will face interrelated social, legal, and institutional barriers. Socially, reparation relies on a base logic that diverges from normative conceptions of fairness, opting instead for uneven resource allocations targeted at the margins. As evidenced by the backlash against affirmative action policies and recent opposition to critical race theory curriculums, the intentional reallocation of resources will undoubtedly come up against social resistance. There will also be legal and institutional challenges. Reparation calls for centralized knowledge about an action based upon protected class attributes. This is difficult under legal conditions that prohibit the collection of such data and/or its consideration in consequential decisions like employment, lending, school admissions, and criminal sentencing. Similar prohibitions written into institutional policies will create blockades against algorithmic reparation within organized settings. There are also real challenges with the kinds of interdisciplinary and socially engaged collaborations necessary for reparative algorithmic projects. Power and compensation disparities persist between computer scientists and social scientists and between academic and non-academic organizations, as well as epistemological schisms that are difficult to reconcile. We note these challenges not to undermine algorithmic reform efforts, but on the contrary, to approach such reforms with clear eyes and optimal preparedness. So to sum up, we made the case in this presentation for algorithmic reparation. This is a rejection of fairness and equality in favor of critical and equitable ends, accounting for and attending to structural and historical inequalities to the computational assemblages that increasingly interweave with daily life. We reviewed the field of fair machine learning, identifying the ways anti-classification, classification parity, and calibration reproduce the inequalities they seek to remedy, proposing instead an intersectional reparative approach. Finally, we highlighted 2 methods of implementation, professional data curation and distributed AI power, as possible avenues forward, while giving a realist lens on the barriers to such projects. In closing, we offer a reminder of a now obvious fact: algorithms reproduce inequality, accompanied by a provocation: why do we cling to fairness? And finally, a proposal to do better through critical, intersectionally informed reparative means. Thank you.
Thank you for a fantastic talk. Are there any questions from the audience? If so, you can use either the chat or the Q&A to type them. I see a question coming in. Moritz Hart asks, do you believe that there is a role for discrimination analysis, for instance, in auditing algorithms and exposing error rate disparities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there is still a role, but the role we have, I think it's crucial not to mistake the measurements for the solution. And I think that's sort of in a nutshell what has happened with like this first wave of fair machine learning, right? Researchers saw that, like, in Compass, there was different error rates among different groups. And then, machine learners, we as a community decided, okay, let's just fix that, and that fixed the problem, right? But rather than taking those audits as like the indications of like, the problem, right? It's symptomatic of something deeper, right? And that, I think, just signals like it provides evidence for how to think about the world, right? And the existing inequalities and how to target the intervention, right? And I do think that once you like come up with a proper intervention, it might still fail on those same metrics in like different sort of way, right? But at least you will know that it's coming from your intervention now and not from the same kinds of metrics that diagnose a problematic world to begin with. I hope that made sense. But that's a great question. I'm happy to follow up more.